This is hell.
Turns out Roe v. Wade is not the end-all and be-all of protecting a woman's reproductive rights. In fact, it turns out that the legal decision's focus on privacy opens the door to government regulation, which makes the decision vulnerable to anti-abortionists who want to restrict women's access to health care related to reproduction. As for a reproductive rights movement based around the idea of choice, well, choice obscures all the structural challenges that make it so not everyone has a choice or the same choices. Here to help us have a much better understanding of the new Texas anti-abortion law and a possible path toward a revived reproductive rights movement, returning to This Is Hell, journalist, author, and essayist Judith Levine wrote the Boston Review article, "Abortion is a Public Good. The Right to Reproductive Health and Agency is a Compelling State Interest." Welcome back to This Is Hell, Judith.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you back on the show. Judith was on back in 2017, and following our conversation with her today, go over to our website, thisishell.com, search on her last name, and find our conversation with her about her N+1 article, Descent into Liberalism, which was fascinating reading, and you can, again, find out more about Judith at her website, judithlevine.com. So you quote Texas's SB 8, the state's near-total abortion ban, which you point out went into effect on September 1st, when the Supreme Court declined to enjoin it. SB 8 reads, Texas has compelling interests from the outset of a woman's pregnancy in protecting the health of the woman and the life of the unborn child. And you add that on October 7th, in response to an emergency request from the U.S., the Department of Justice, a federal judge, blocked the law. And you cite that judge saying other courts may find a way to avoid the same conclusion. But you argue whatever the Supreme Court of the United States does, the anti-abortion movement will not be stopped. It will carry on as before, powered by the same morally and politically muscular message that SB 8 communicates. The government cares about what happens to women's bodies. And when Texas deputizes the masses to enforce its ban through civil lawsuits, it is not just slithering out of judicial scrutiny, nor is it simply doing what red states do, privatize the government. SB 8 tells the world that pregnancy and birth are not only the state's business, they're everybody's business. So, Judith, this just made me think of a few things. I remember stories about people living in the police state of the Soviet Union, and they would never know who was a spy for the state or who wasn't. The way it was portrayed in the U.S. was this dystopian Soviet communism. In 2016, BBC runs a report that says that news that Iran has deployed thousands of undercover agents to enforce rules on dress has cast the spotlight on an institution that is a major feature of daily life in several Muslim-majority countries. And then here in the United States, we have this colonial history of the so-called good wife who would supposedly uphold Puritan laws. So, Judith, after that very long introduction with SB 8 in Texas, how would you describe the relationship all Texas residents now have with each other? Is everyone a spy, morality police, or overseers of a sort of puritanical law?
Well, potentially they are. And I would also interject that, excuse me, after the, hold on a minute, after the, that judge blocked the law and joined the law, 2 or 3 days later, it went to the Fifth Circuit, the Fifth District, rather, of Texas, which is a much more conservative court, and they reinstated the law. So SB 8 is back in business. So it was blocked for 2 days, maybe 3 days. So what does it do? Yes, it potentially makes every single person, not only in the state of Texas, in fact, any place, because the 2 people who have sued people who have abetted a woman having an abortion, that could be a provider, that could be a friend who lends money, that could be an Uber driver who takes her to the clinic. 2 people who brought suit were not living in Texas. So it brings the entire United States of America, and who knows, maybe the world, into policing what women do with their bodies.
So what happens to a society when everybody is a potential spy or vigilante, not just within your state or within your city or county, anybody online, anywhere? What happens to a society when we have that kind of adversarial or overseer relationship with each other?
Well, one thing is that citizens join the corporation and the government in watching each other. So maybe it's more democratic that we get to be cops. All of us get to be cops, in addition to the NSA and Facebook. Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes everybody even more suspicious of one another than we already are, thanks to the Trump years and a polarization in general. People are suspicious of each other, and one of the pernicious things about this law is that it pretends that the state is not enforcing anything. I mean, the law is written by the state legislature of Texas. It's not something that was arrived at democratically. In fact, the majority of Texans, like the majority of Americans, support a woman's right to end a pregnancy. So in Texas, that majority is a lot smaller than it is in other places. It's a really, really conservative state, a very Christian state. But nevertheless, the legislature of Texas does not represent the people in this regard. And with gerrymandering, it's going to represent the people even less. So do we want to be not only politically in opposition to each other, which I would argue is not a bad thing? Politics is something that's necessary and good. But do we want to be interfering with each other's very, very individual bodily decisions? You named before, you talked about other police states. You could add the Stasi and, in East Germany. You could certainly add, fascist states such as the Nazis. But the United States has its own history of deputizing citizens to watch over the bodies of other people. And that's in the slave patrols, which began in the 18th century. They began as soon as there was slavery. And that was when there were vigilantes, kind of freelance slave catchers, but also states allowed and encouraged, and local governments encouraged individual white people to go out and capture enslaved people who might have run away, or even who might have been, just as the Texas law put it, just sort of hanging around. I forget the term that they used, without the permission of the enslavers. In fact, in the North, there's a really interesting book about this kidnappers club in New York City, where people would go around and just, commandeer even freeborn slaves and children, freeborn African Americans and children. That's what the movie 12 Years a Slave was about, where a freeborn man was just, kidnapped and sold into slavery. So Texas, even before the Texas Rangers, Texas deputized these bands of these patrols to go around and look for Black people who were out without permission, and they were also allowed to inflict punishment on those people with the lash right there and then.
Yeah, and in your writing, the phrase that you were looking for was strolling about.
That's right, strolling about.
So does that history, does that create a fertile environment for vigilante law to be used against those seeking an abortion? And is that history why SB 8 is written the way it is? Is there simply a culture of vigilantism in Texas that now might have an impact on the rest of the United States?
Well, let me first say, women of color have objected to, people of color have objected to comparing abortion and the lack of abortion rights to slavery. And that's a really well taken criticism. Not being able to have an abortion is not the same as being in bondage, and being able to have an abortion is not the same as freeing oneself from bondage. But that said, yes, we have a history in which, you certainly can see the history of these slave patrols as presaging the carceral state that we have today. In fact, some historians look at those slave patrols as the original United States police departments. So if police departments are racist today, that they have a long history of being racist. So it's not just the state of Texas, that has this way of thinking that, number one, people need to be policed to live correctly. That's the first thing, that we couldn't make our decisions ourselves, or that communities couldn't make decisions, couldn't come to, democratic agreements as to what is a good way to live. And also the idea that protecting the fetus means punishing the woman. That's a really carceral, sort of adversarial way that we think about justice. It's the way that the courts are set up. You're on one side or the other. You're the defendant or you're the perpetrator. And you can't be for both. It's not possible that, say, a person who does a violent crime might, him or herself, have been the victim of violence. That's often really the case. So in this case, you look at the fetus is this innocent victim, and the person carrying the fetus is somehow the antagonist or the torturer or, of the kill or the murderer of the fetus. So you have to sacrifice the mother in order to save the fetus. It is true that when you have an abortion, you end a potential life, but most people have an abortion when the fetus wouldn't be able to live on its own anyway. And most people have an abortion 6 weeks, which is when this law cuts off the ability to have abortion. At 6 weeks, a fetus is not even called a fetus. It's just an embryo. So it's not even, it's a zygote, I think is what they call it. It's not even a fetus. And when they talk about cardiac, the law says that when cardiac activity can be detected, that's when the person can't have an abortion. There is a sort of a beating that can be detected, but there is no organized heart at that point in gestation. So there's no real heart. It's not really a fetus. It's potential life as much as, your sperm is potential life.
And you also point out that feminists fight for pregnant people's and fetuses' health, too, for universal, affordable, accessible reproductive health care. But we have not boldly made an opposite, equally powerful case. The right and ability to terminate a pregnancy safely and without cost, bias, or stigma as a guarantor, if not the only one, of the existential equality and human flourishing of all uterus-bearing people. How do laws concerning reproductive rights lead to inequality for women of all forms, not just in healthcare? Because I think that's a really important point to make, how this affects inequality in general for women. So how do laws concerning reproductive rights lead to inequality for women?
The ability to do with your body what you want to do with your body, which is called bodily autonomy. It's the reason the right to bodily autonomy is the right to not be enslaved, the right to not be tortured, the right to not be forced to do labor that, against your will or for no pay. The ability, so that's number one, that's a human right, bodily autonomy, a universal human right. But for a person who has a uterus, simply having a uterus and therefore having the potential to reproduce should not put a person in a position of not being able to make decisions about her life, not being able to make a decision whether she wants to have a family, whether she wants to live here or live there, whether she wants to try to earn a lot of money or not earn a lot of money, whether she wants to take drugs, whether she wants to, be a downhill, slalom skier where she's risking her life, with her everyday, recreation. The ability to decide whether and when to have children affects absolutely everything about the life of a person who has a uterus. If you cannot do that, you are not the existential equal of people who don't have uteruses. Now, this is true, like people recognize this in a very daily way. Like, the woman gets pregnant, the man doesn't get pregnant. So who has to deal with it? The woman has to deal with it. This is just, this is just reality. So then how do we make people equal? You have laws and protections, and you don't have laws that that infringe on the ability to be equal. You have policies and institutions and practices that allow every person in every body to be able to have as full a life as they can, as equally as they can with everyone else. So that's just not just the difference between people who have uteruses and people who don't have uteruses. This is the difference between people who are maybe transgender or not transgender. This is the difference between people who have disabilities, who don't have disabilities, who are aged, who are young, who are children, who are adults. All of these things, we all live in a body. And what can we do as a society to encourage and allow and promote the greatest possible flourishing for every single person in every single body? And once you start to infringe on that ability, then you start to increase disability, increase inequality, not just allow it, but increase it. The early abortion rights movement wanted repeal of abortion laws, wanted no abortion laws, nothing that regulated abortion any more than any other medical procedure might be regulated. But the thing that the states, the anti-abortion states, have done is they've imposed all kinds of gratuitous regulations, particularly on abortion providers. So they have to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. They have to have the corridors a certain, width. They have to, there's just hundreds and hundreds of these laws that are made just particularly for abortion providers, and their express purpose is to make it hard for abortion providers to be able to afford to practice. And the result has been, in more than 80% of counties in the United States, there are no abortion providers.
So is legalization the wrong path forward, or even in the past, was it the wrong path for reproductive rights? Should have, instead of legalization, should have been more focused on decriminalization?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a similar movement among sex workers, that legalization always comes with regulation. So what you want to have is as few laws as possible. I think that's true of pretty much all victimless personal conduct. We should have as few laws as possible. In that sense, I'm kind of a libertarian. So that sex workers are fighting often for decriminalization and not for legalization, because in past history, what legalization has meant is that the police have overseen, the conduct of women or people who do sex work, and they've had to register and all kinds of other things and submit to various medical, tests and all the rest of it. So yes, decriminalization, the repeal of all abortion laws, would be the optimal thing.
And you write that states have a compelling interest, a profound obligation to defend the right to abortion. Abortion is a public good. So this is probably the easiest question I had to write this week. How is abortion a public good?
Abortion is a public good because in order for us all to have happy, healthy lives, I believe that if everyone has rights, if everyone has justice, then other people also, benefit from that. Now, as you know, as an anti-capitalist, power is a limited commodity, and when some people have it, other people lose it. But in terms of kind of personal life, sexual life, what you do sexually unless it's rape, is not going to harm me. So everybody who was worried that gay marriage was going to, somehow destroy straight marriage, they turned out to be wrong about that. So the greatest good, Adam Smith, like a lot of kind of, even capitalist economists argued that the greatest good for individuals will redound to everybody. So when you look, for instance, there's research all over the world that when people, women and girls, are able to control their reproductive lives, they can get more education. Smaller families mean that children can be cared for better, and people have better health. People can contribute to the workforce. They can therefore make more money. They can participate in politics. They can be part of the community. They can do volunteer work, so that that the freedoms of women are correlated all over the world with societies that have more democracy, that have more peace, that have less authoritarianism, and conversely, those societies that have more authoritarianism, more misogyny, more sexual inequality are also the ones that have the most war, that are most aggressive toward other countries and toward minorities within their own countries. And so women's equality, or the equality of people who have uteruses, the equality of people of sexual minorities, the equality of people with disabilities, all of those things are correlated with more stable societies, more democratic societies, and more egalitarian and prosperous societies.
Abortion rights are good for everybody, no matter if you have a uterus or not. And I think that's a really important thing to remind everybody. You ask, why haven't we linked abortion to the Commonwealth? And then you argue that the answer lies in Roe v. Wade and in a strategy conceived and led by a liberal, largely white advocacy community that depends on Roe to protect abortion, and therefore makes the defense of Roe its premier organizing goal. To elevate Roe in this way is to accept a compromise as the sine qua non that is an essential thing that is absolutely necessary of a movement, reform of abortion laws rather than their total repeal. Is Roe v. Wade a warning about the shortcomings of reform and the need for abolition?
Yes, I think it is. The tension between reform and radical change is always one for every social justice movement. You want to improve people's lives today in small ways. For instance, people who are incarcerated, you want there to be better food, let's say, in prison. What you really want is there to be no prisons. But in the meantime, the argument against reforms is that it legitimates the institution. So if you have reforms of abortion and regulation of abortion, you're legitimizing the state's right to interfere in any way. At the same time, we do have Roe now. I don't want to lose it because it's all we've got standing between us and, the abyss. But we have, in effect, we have lost it, because most women in this country live in places where they can't get abortions. So it's not really a right. I do want to interject here for a moment and make a distinction between abortion rights and abortion justice.
Okay.
Abortion justice or reproductive justice. Reproductive justice was an idea that was coined in 1994 by a group of 12 women of color, right before a big conference, International Women's Conference on Population. They looked around and they saw that a movement that was mostly led by white middle-class women was not going to be able to stand up for the needs and rights of women of color, of poor women, of women in the global South. And so they thought of this idea, reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is the intersection of reproductive rights and justice. And what they meant by that is not only the right to have a child or not to have a child, but the right to have a child in an environment that's healthy, one in which there's no violence. And also access to healthcare. So rather than choice, they talk about access. That is, everybody has healthcare that they can get, because if you can't access it, then you have no choice, right? So choice itself is a kind of privilege. So access rather than choice. And justice, meaning, all of the things that we associate with justice. Justice is something that's social. It's between people, among people, and it's not individual the way rights are. Rights are important, human rights are important, but social justice is also important.
And you point out that a right resting on Roe dies with the death of Roe. In the short term, This will be a catastrophe in states like Mississippi, Oklahoma, Texas, and dozens of others. It already is one. But paradoxically, losing Roe might force us to rebuild a movement, one based on the assertion of reproductive rights and sexual freedom, nested within a vision of broad social justice. And so you were just saying that you don't want to lose Roe, but do we need to lose Roe v. Wade as made legal? Reproductive rights as made legal under Roe v. Wade in order to finally have reproductive rights for all?
We have laws. Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, which established that separate education, racially segregated education is not equal. We now have more racial segregation in our schools than we had in 1954 when Brown was ruled. So you have these rulings, and they're not necessarily. We don't necessarily practice, even those rulings that establish principles that we endorse. The 13th Amendment, the amendment that is supposed to outlaw involuntary servitude and slavery, has this carve out that everybody has liberty from involuntary servitude, except if they have committed a crime, which opens up, to slave labor inside of prisons. So we don't, Roe. I don't think we need to have Roe, to lose Roe in order to make a more radical movement and to expand reproductive justice. As I said before, we practically have lost it anyway. If it's overturned, you don't need to lose it in order to make a more radical movement. What we do need to do, though, is to get away from the very narrow terms of Roe. So the narrow terms of Roe include the right to privacy. The right to privacy is, that the police can't, barge into your bedroom. This is the Fourth Amendment too. The right to privacy. You can't, the involuntary search and seizure without the judge allowing. You can't. There's a lot of things that privacy comes from. Privacy is a right. The Ninth Amendment is an interesting one in the Constitution. What it says is that just because we haven't enumerated a particular right in the Constitution doesn't mean it can be denied to people. So what it says is that there are other rights that maybe we didn't think of when we wrote this document, but they emanate from, they're in a penumbra of, a sort of aura of the other rights. So for instance, Fourth Amendment against search and seizure, that is a privacy right. But privacy is a kind of weak right too. There's a lot of exceptions to when the police can barge into your apartment, or, if you're on the sex offender registry, they can just follow your every move. They can put an ankle bracelet on you if you're a parolee. So there's a lot of privacy rights that are, the privacy right is weak. I named a couple of rulings around privacy that really allowed coercion. For instance, there was a case in 1917 about compulsory vaccination, and the court ruled that compulsory vaccination in the interest of the public health was permissible. that it overrode the right, to individual privacy. Another one in 1927, really infamous decision about eugenics. There was a woman who was institutionalized in a mental institution. The state of Virginia wanted to sterilize her. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the great esteemed Oliver Wendell Holmes said that she should be sterilized because she was the child of a, quote, feeble-minded mother, and she had had a, quote, feeble-minded child. And he said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So privacy didn't save that woman. Privacy, for all you anti-vaxxers out there, doesn't protect you either. Compulsory vaccination is constitutional. So privacy itself is a weak right. And privacy also, I argue, is, it might even be non-existent at this point. Every single thing you do online is tracked by a lot of different institutions and corporations. I don't think people really care that much about privacy anymore. People who have a webcam in their shower want publicity. They don't want privacy. So people are not, and also I think young people don't believe that they can have a life. If you had privacy, you just can't have a life. The number of, I think the percentage of people statistically who read the terms and conditions of any, the privacy terms and conditions of any contract you make online is 0. So people don't really care about it. They just know it's not possible. So, and the other thing is that poor people and people of color have historically been surveilled by state institutions, state agencies that are purportedly protecting their children, that there's surveillance and policing and over-policing in communities of color. So people are being watched all the time, no matter what they do. So there isn't, if there's anything called privacy, either you're really, really rich and you have a big gate around your life, or you're, living off the grid on the top of a mountain and, you don't go online and you don't have a mobile phone, so almost no one has privacy to begin with. So that's itself, like, to be trying to protect privacy, I think is just the wrong direction. Then the next thing is, from privacy flows this idea of choice. I'm an individual, I can do what I want. So I'm going to choose to have an abortion or not choose to have an abortion. And as we said before, if there's not access to healthcare, for instance, you can't choose to have an abortion anyway. So these are, and then the third thing about Roe is that it gave a lot of influence to doctors. The whole thing was, doctors were very important in the decision of Roe. They came to Roe with testimony about all of the horrible, injuries and deaths that they'd seen from illegal abortions, but they still wanted a hand in it. So the ruling says this is a decision between a woman and her doctor. Why should it be between a woman and her doctor? Why shouldn't it just be a woman? Well, who's the doctor? Nobody even has a doctor anymore. You have a primary care physician who talks to you for 3 minutes, if you even have that. So these are all, it's a narrow ruling that is protecting this massive existential question. Do I get to use my body the way I want to use it without anybody interfering? So we could make the whole thing a lot more radical without, this is a long way of saying, no, we don't have to lose Roe to make it more radical. We may end up losing Roe anyway, but that's not the end of the world, is really what my point was, that if we lose Roe, we can keep going. We can keep fighting for this, because we're going to have to fight for it. The same number of abortions take place in places where abortions are illegal as where they are legal. So women still have abortions, they just have unsafe abortions.
So on privacy, you write the neoliberal myth that your fate is your choice and your troubles are your fault obscures history, economics, and social reality. It discourages collective action and mobilizes shame. Together, privacy and shame cloak harm perpetrated by those with power, from sexual harassment in the workplace to child sexual abuse at home. Meanwhile, communities whose facial features are stored in police files and whose families are under constant surveillance by protective agencies have no illusion that their privacy ever existed. So how can inequality of privacy be overcome? Would ending neoliberalism end inequality in privacy?
Neoliberalism is the idea that the market, that unfettered markets will solve all problems. And as we know, markets are not egalitarian. The whole structure of capitalism is that most people have to lose in order for a few people to win. So the idea that, we as a society don't have any responsibility for each other. If you have a really, really bad wage, for instance, if you're making minimum wage and you can't afford an apartment or a place to live for your kids, then that must be your fault, because after all, you have all of the opportunities of the market. Would getting rid of neoliberalism allow for real reproductive freedom? Is that what you're asking me?
Exactly.
You are at the top of the hour, you talked about, capitalism being the primary source of inequality around reproductive issues. And I don't think that's all it is, because, in communist countries and fascist countries and countries that don't have capitalism, and countries, with all kinds of economic systems, you still have control of women's bodies. I mean, this was happening way before capitalism existed. So capitalism is not great for sexual equality, but it's not the only cause of sexual inequality. Nor is capitalism the primary motive for a lot of people who want to curtail women's rights to do with their body what they want to do. And I think anti-abortion people really do believe that abortion is murder. That is a legitimate moral position. I don't agree with it. I don't want them imposing their morality on me, but it's not necessarily to do with abortion, with capitalism. In fact, there is a sort of small feminist socialist anti-abortion movement. The idea that if we had, there's an argument that if we had a real economically and socially egalitarian society where we had childcare and good health care and housing for everybody, then nobody would have abortions. That's the argument. But the fact is, people have abortions because they don't want to have a kid. It has nothing to do with how much money they have, or, a lot of people don't have a kid because they can't afford it, but people also don't have a kid because they don't want a kid. So capitalism, even if we got rid of capitalism, we still have to protect people's bodily autonomy. It's not gonna, that won't solve it. It'll solve a lot of other things, but it won't solve this.
And that's a really good point. You also write that just as communities can be safer without police, pregnancy and birth can be healthier and less stressful without doctors, but the rejection of medical paternalism, whether that's making an exception for a Texan abortion patient after 6 weeks or sterilizing inmates in a California prison, does not exempt government from its obligations to provide universal, accessible, high-quality health care along with decent housing, a clean environment, and social and economic supports for families. Choice is a neoliberal fiction. If you can't get it, you can't choose it. So under neoliberalism, does the government have an obligation to provide universal, accessible, high-quality health care? Has the government, via neoliberalism, abdicated that responsibility? And is a government that abdicates that responsibility sustainable?
Well, a neoliberal government privatizes everything, and it does abdicate the responsibility of the state to look after its people. I mean, we have social democracies where, you have a little bit of capitalism. It's like, places that have decent health care and child care, they have some capitalism. These two things are not completely mutually exclusive. But the ideology of neoliberalism itself is one that says that we don't need the government to do things. The government shouldn't do things, that the market will solve all problems. Well, it doesn't. For-profit healthcare does not, we all know for-profit healthcare does not deliver health care to people, in an accessible, affordable way. Doesn't work. So the government, I think libertarians tends to be like an idea that the government should do nothing or the government should do everything. The government should do certain things. And frankly, I think certain things should be private. Like, I don't want to pay for basketball arenas, for instance. That should be a private enterprise. So the government the government meaning the people, meaning taxpayers, and that means equitable taxation, in order to have a well-functioning society, and morally, it has an obligation to make sure that everyone has health care. So hands off my body doesn't mean the government has no obligation to my health, and that also includes an environment that's clean, an end to climate change. If we want to keep children, if the right wants to keep children, safe and living in the future, they should be screaming about climate change, because our children are going to be broiling up. So, there's a lot of hypocrisy, of course. And it's kind of true of any single issue. If you're only about stopping abortions and then you don't think about what happens to the child after it's born, you're leaving out you're leaving out even a lot of what you believe in, that you believe in a good life for children. Well, how's that going to happen? We have to end climate change. We have to end inequality. We have to end, rapacious capitalism. So, each one of these things, you can't, these things all intersect, right? I think Audre Lorde said, you can't have single issue politics because we don't live single issue lives. And that's true for, what you do with your body. But bodily autonomy is such a basic bottom line thing that I think it precedes all of this, because all of these bad systems allow for bodily autonomy to be infringed, to be violated. But I can't think of any human right that's more basic than that one. You don't get to do to my body something that I don't want. You can't torture me. You can't, enslave me. You can't make me have a baby.
You were mentioning climate change, and you also point out the impact of poverty on the mother and the fetus, as well as racism on the mother and the fetus when they are people of color. Now, does poverty and racism, do those threaten fetuses more than abortion does? Because I'm wondering why the anti-abortion movement isn't focusing on being anti-poverty, anti-racism. As you pointed out, if you're really concerned about the children, being more focused on climate change.
Absolutely. Racism and poverty have a much, much higher negative effect on mothers and fetuses and children than abortion does. Abortion is a very, very safe procedure. And if you do it early enough, it's a very, very simple procedure and a quick procedure. I know because I've had abortions. But women of color, especially African-American women, have much higher rates of infant and maternal mortality. This includes African-American women who are middle class and educated. Much, much higher rates of miscarriage, of low birth weight babies. All of those have to do with lack of access to good prenatal care and child care, child health care. But they also have to do with this generations of history of oppression and daily life stress of racism. And you see this also with Indigenous peoples, with Native Americans, that there is the stress and the harms are passed on generation to generation. And that's why you can have, a Black woman who has a PhD and lives in a big house and her husband is a stockbroker, and she still has a low birth weight baby. When you look at, and also doctors don't take Black patients as seriously. They under-medicate them for pain. they unmedicate the campaign. They don't listen to, if they say that something is wrong, they don't listen to them. They don't listen to their symptoms. And so people get much worse care than white people do. So all of those things are much, 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 much more dangerous to the health of mothers and babies.
And you're right that not surprisingly, the targets of the intrauterine war on drugs are overwhelmingly Black, brown, and poor. Many are among the most marginalized. SB 8 will also disproportionately affect Texans of color, who make up 2/3 of the state's abortion patients. What would be the impact of the end of the war on drugs on parental rights of Black, brown, and poor parents?
Well, this is a really important thing. There are many, many women who use drugs, for instance, who are marginalized in other ways, who are poor in bad health, who are being prosecuted for those very things, or if they have a miscarriage or if they have an abortion. They're held in captivity. They're made to undergo cesarean sections that they don't need. And this is the war on drugs that has now invaded women's uteruses. The war on drugs has not only destroyed many, many countries and wasted billions and billions of dollars and led to, gang warfare all over the world and all sorts of really awful things, distorts economies, but it hurts individual pregnant people. The war on drugs is just a pernicious, horrible thing that we should just totally get rid of. And not only that, it's landed millions of people in prison who have not done anything wrong. So, so that would be another thing. But, we see the ways that racism, that white supremacy, that economic inequality compounds this effort to control women's bodies, to control women's sexuality. And the last thing I will say, because I see the hour's up, is that abortion is about sex. The way you get an unwanted baby, an unwanted pregnancy, is by heterosexual intercourse. That's the only way it works. There's no other way. And yet the discourse of abortion has completely erased sex from the picture. Anybody who lived before abortion was legal knows the terror that was involved in, thinking, oh shit, I didn't take my pill yesterday. I didn't put in my diaphragm. That terror, what it did, people had to get married. There was shotgun weddings, all this kind of stuff. It was really bad for sex and the ability to contracept, number one, and to have an accessible, safe medical abortion, number two, really improves sex. And that is a very important thing. That's another right that people have, is a right to pleasure. It's a public good, I contend. And that's another reason that we really need to support abortion, is for sexual freedom and for sexual pleasure.
And the pursuit of happiness, as talked about in
the
Declaration of Independence.
It is.
We have been speaking with Judith Levine, who wrote the Boston Review article, "Abortion is a Public Good. The Right to Reproductive Health and Agency is a Compelling State Interest." You can follow Judith on Twitter at Judith Levine. You can find out more about her at her website, judithlevine.com. Her most recent book is The Feminist and the Sex Offender: Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, which she co-authored with Erica R. Miners. One last question for you, Judith, and as we do with all of our guests, I promise, we ask the question from hell. The question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. Judith, is the anti-abortion movement in any way a class war on the poor?
No. I don't think its effect is a class war on the poor, but I don't think that the movement itself is a class war on the poor.
That's not its intent.
That's not its intent. That's one of its effects.
Which is very important. The outcomes, even though they're not, as you point out in your writing, the intent of something may not be what the outcome ends up being.
Yeah.
Well, Judith, I really appreciate you being back on the show. People should check out our earlier conversation with you back in 2017. Go to our website, thisishell.com, and search on the last name Levine. Thank you so much for being on our show. This is an exceptional article, and I really appreciate you being back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.